From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. After nearly a year since the dramatic raids on former House Speaker Gordon Fox's home and State House office, the 53-year-old disgraced lawmaker was charged in a federal public corruption case this week. In his first court appearance, Fox stood before a federal judge and admitted he was guilty.
Oh, at this point, it's still a process you got to go through.
Bribery, wire fraud, and tax evasion. Former House Speaker Gordon Fox facing 3 counts in a federal public corruption case.
That former Speaker Fox looted his campaign account repeatedly over a number of years to pay for plainly personal expenses.
In an investigation that spanned 18 months, prosecutors say Fox accepted a $52,000 bribe in 2008 to approve a liquor license for Eastside restaurant Shark when Fox was vice chairman of the Providence Licensing Board. Fox is also accused of transferring $108,000 from his campaign accounts for personal use.
When you ask people for money to support your campaign for public office and you use it for something else, you've lied to them. There is no other way to say it. You've committed fraud.
Gordon, do you feel remorse?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That goes without question.
Within hours of the charges becoming public, Fox appeared before a federal judge pleading guilty to all 3 counts.
We're still in the legal proceeding, and I don't want to feel callous to any of the people of the state of Rhode Island, any donors, including, the people close to me, the people that looked up to me, my family. It's tough.
As part of the plea agreement, prosecutors will recommend 3 years behind bars. If the judge accepts the deal, he will be sentenced on June 11th.
I'm not sure if it is these officials are overcome with greed, or that maybe it's arrogance that they think they can get away with this, or maybe a combination of both as to why we keep finding ourselves here.
This week on Newsmakers, we're going in depth on the Gordon Fox public corruption case. I am joined to my right by WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi, and to my left we have former U.S. Attorney for Rhode Island, Robert Correnti. He is also an Eyewitness News legal analyst. Bob, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate it. You've been the state's top federal prosecutor for public corruption cases. You know what happens behind the scenes. Looking what you've seen in the public domain, at least, should we expect more charges? What is your gut on this one?
I don't think so.
Why not?
In most of these cases, by the time the information or indictment comes down, the prosecution has a pretty good idea how they're going to charge the case. It's unlikely they would break it up into smaller pieces.
So when Gordon Fox signed the plea agreement in this case, does he have to lay it all out on the table? Is there a moment where he sits in a room with prosecutors and he has to proffer anything else that he's done?
It can follow a number of different paths. Sometimes they will have the defendant himself come in and lay out a proffer like that. Sometimes the attorneys will come in and do what's called an attorney proffer. And there are other times where the situation is already so clear that the government really doesn't need to see that laid out in that fashion.
Yeah, but what if sometimes one case can beget another, right?
Right.
So what if somebody comes forward now and says X, Y, and Z happened, they approach the FBI, they feel more comfortable now that a public corruption case has come out, and they offer more information. Can the U.S. Attorney's Office then levy further charges, or is this it as part of the plea agreement?
There's a provision in the plea agreement that sort of circumscribes what is covered, and the government, as part of the plea agreement, agrees that it will not bring any further charges based on those facts. If somebody were to come forward with a completely different set of facts, a different set of bribes, what have you, that's not covered by the plea agreement, and the government could open a new investigation. And
it didn't look from reading the plea agreement that there was any commitment by Gordon Fox to cooperate, right?
That's right.
And what does that say?
Well, if there were a cooperation agreement, you would expect to see that in the document itself.
And this was not a conspiracy case. What would have to have had happened? Usually when we see these, conspiracy is one of the charges. Be it organized crime, be it public corruption, that is one of the charges. Right. Why wasn't conspiracy part of this, do you think?
Hard to tell, because we don't know what else they had. We don't know who else was involved, obviously, because nobody else has been charged. But the reason you see the conspiracy charge so frequently is it allows the government a longer statute of limitations, potentially. It can look back for older acts.
Okay, Ted?
People are going to wonder, rightly or wrongly, whether Gordon Fox might have ever accepted a bribe elsewhere in public life. He was in public life a long time. Of course, there's no evidence at the moment that he did, but after seeing the facts in this case, people wonder that. Is there any obligation on the U.S. Attorney's Office's part or the Attorney General in Rhode Island's part to, do a deeper examination after finding this out of the other things he didn't like? Or do they kind of just need to wait until if someone ever came forward, then they would do it? Do they need to proactively look for bribery or just wait and see if anyone says something else happened?
I think typically if you go to the trouble to undertake an investigation like this, they're time-consuming, they're expensive, you want to try to dig up whatever you can find, obviously. But by the same token, if you have a relatively straightforward, easy case that you can get a simple conviction on, the fact is he's going to be out of office, he's going to federal prison for 3 years. At a certain point, it doesn't make a lot of sense to continue to dig things up.
So it's a little different from like a truth commission that wants to get every last fact out there. Their job is to get a conviction and make clear what he did in this set of facts.
That's exactly right. And this being a sort of a nonviolent crime, a white-collar crime, you're not going to see these 20, 30-year sentences that you might see in a gun case or a gang case or something like that. A 3-year sentence is sort of more in line with those kinds of crimes. Because really what you're trying to do is to get that person out of public office and get him to a place where he can't betray the public trust again.
On that bribery charge that Ted brought up, I asked U.S. Attorney Peter Nerona if those that allegedly gave that $52,000 bribe will be charged. And his answer to that was, and I'm paraphrasing, that they, along with their law enforcement partners, will continue to examine this. But the U.S. Attorney's Office can't charge them in a bribery case, can they? Because the statute of limitations on the federal end has expired. That's my understanding, correct?
That appears to be the case. There was a fairly unusual provision in this plea agreement under which Mr. Fox waived the statute of limitations with respect to that bribery charge.
Okay, so but before you keep going, why would he do that? You've added another charge.
He may have done that as part of a horse trading. Okay. I'll do that if you don't charge something else.
All right, so continue on the bribery aspect. Again, it seems to me the statute has expired.
It certainly looks that way. Now, if this had been charged as a conspiracy case, and to go back to that, the reason you see so many bribery conspiracy charges brought in cases like this is that the statute of limitations in a conspiracy runs from the date of the last act in furtherance of the conspiracy. So you could have a very long period of time, but if your last act is inside that 5-year window, you can charge the entire conspiracy.
And in this particular case, the last act would have been in 2014, which is part of the transferring campaign funds to his private account.
Not necessarily, because the campaign fund violation might not have been part of whatever the bribery conspiracy was. So there's some art and some science involved in how you frame the conspiracy, who's involved, which acts you're going after, and there's all kinds of infighting in these cases about, is this one conspiracy or two, that sort of thing.
So is the ball then in Attorney General Peter Kilmartin's court? The state statute of limitations is 10 years. It's still in that window. This act allegedly happened in 2008. If anyone outside a conspiracy is going to get charged, is that going to have to happen on the state end?
That would certainly be a better option at this point. Because the state does have the longer statute of limitation, if the other people involved are going to be charged, I would look for it on the state side.
Okay. Ted?
I was surprised, I think a bunch of people were, by how impassioned your successor, Peter Nerona, U.S. Attorney, was in his speech at the press conference announcing these charges. I mean, he didn't limit himself to the facts of this case. He talked a lot about the need to stamp out public corruption in Rhode Island, the need to not accept those things. Were you at all surprised? What did you take away from his comments as someone who's been in that same position? The fact that he wanted to go further than just talking about what Gordon Fox did in this case, but talk more broadly about the culture in political life in Rhode Island.
I think that's the right time and place for that speech, and I was in the position of having to make that same speech a number of times. It sort of seems to be an endless parade of people, walking into the courthouse with raincoats over their heads, but it just never seems to go away.
Why do you think that is? Is it, and is that truly, everyone here in Rhode Island is like, oh, only in Rhode Island, but of course we see other high-profile public corruption cases across the country. But why do you think that endless parade of people with raincoats over their heads goes into federal court all the time?
I think part of the problem, part of the core problem here is we have an enormous percentage of our public officials who run unopposed. So they're not being held up to the light, they're not being held accountable, they get to the point where they feel like they can do whatever they want, and they do. I think that's the problem.
Did you ever talk with your colleagues before, since other U.S. attorneys, to try to get does Rhode Island seem to be different? Is it more prevalent here? Is that your sense, public corruption, or does it just feel that way because we're watching, we're the ones here, we're the ones watching, we know these cases better, and it's really on par with other places?
We're certainly not unique. I mean, New Jersey has a terrible problem, Illinois has had a terrible problem, Louisiana, but we're probably in the top 10 anyway of states with public corruption problems, and it seems to be magnified because of the size of the state. It just, people pay more attention to it.
And did you ever think, were there systemic changes you thought there are basic things we can do? Is it just a more competitive election process with more people running and fewer people running and opposed? Or are there other things you think need to change about how, or could change in Rhode Island, the way our government is structured and the laws we have, that might make it less likely here?
I think that certainly having a more robust political atmosphere would certainly help. I think there are some structural changes that you could make inside the state government that would help to diffuse the power a little bit. I mean, we have a very unusual setup in which you have a governor's office which is close to being a figurehead and an enormous amount of power centered in the General Assembly, and particularly in the Speaker's office, and that has its benefits and its disadvantages. And one disadvantage is that it's hard to find out what's going on.
One of the reactions that both Ted and I have gotten in the wake of this story is some people feel the 3-year deal that Fox cut with the U.S. Attorney's Office isn't sufficient. They argue if the average Joe had embezzled or robbed a bank, say, of $108,000, they'd be getting a decade or two for that. What do you think? You have sat there. Would you have taken that deal or gone to trial for more or looked for more? Or do you think 3 years is about right in the case with these 3 counts?
It's hard to tell from the outside because we don't know what evidentiary problems there were, what other factors went into that negotiation. But in the federal court, the sentences are all imposed according to the federal sentencing guidelines. So you have a pretty good matrix going in for what you're looking at.
And people, I don't think a lot of people realize, in Rhode Island we have a parole system. Mm-hmm. There is no parole.
No, there's no parole in the federal system. So that's a factor that maybe the general public needs to pay more attention to, because in the state court, it's not uncommon to see somebody sentenced to 10 years with 4 to serve, and then when he or she is subjected to parole, they might be out in 2.
Right.
So that 10-year sentence becomes 2 years. In federal court, it's not 100%, but it's very close to 100%. If you get a 3-year sentence, you're gone for 3 years.
Which not to guess, but what kind of prison will Gordon Fox end up in, assuming that Judge Lisi approves his plea agreement? He's going to have to serve 3 years.
Yeah, that's something that, believe it or not, the court really doesn't have much of a say in. That is left to the discretion of the Bureau of Prisons, and depends on what kind of openings they have, what kind of facilities are available. So,
if there are any medical conditions
issues,
that
they
have to deal with. And his sentencing, I believe, is June 11th now is scheduled for. Does he, again, if Judge Lisi approves the plea agreement, he's going to serve 3 years in prison, does he go to jail on June 11th, or will there be a date set later for him to go to, and how long would that be?
He will be given a report date. What happens next is, during the interim between the change of plea hearing, which is what we just saw the other day, and the imposition of sentence, the probation department, Federal Probation Department, prepares what's called a pre-sentence report that gets submitted to the judge, and she uses that as part of the process in imposing the sentence. He's then given a report date sometime thereafter.
One thing we now know is, and we had heard leading up to this, there was a grand jury. They were hearing testimony, presumably. They were probably issuing subpoenas. Mm-hmm. Why wasn't this an indictment? That's usually this was something called an information, which comes directly from the U.S. Attorney's Office to the courts, and he is charged. It wasn't an indictment. Why would they go that route?
There are 2 different procedures. The indictment is used if you've gone all the way through the grand jury process, they've listened to witnesses, they've collected evidence, and there's no plea deal in place. They will issue the indictment, and that's how the case begins. If there is a plea deal, they don't need to take that step because, as you say, the U.S. Attorney can do it by information.
And it is a citizen's right to go through the grand jury process. Sure. You have to waive the indictment, and I believe Gordon Fox did just that.
Right. In every information, it will begin with a recitation that the defendant has waived indictment by the grand jury, because that is a constitutional provision. Once that's waived, the information is basically just a short form way to charge the case without going through the formality of the grand jury indictment.
Gordon Fox ran in some powerful circles in Rhode Island all these years that he was involved in politics. Is it possible he told prosecutors about other possible wrongdoing, other allegations, gave people up, suggested there are things they should look into, or would we know that by now it would have been mentioned or something, or the case wouldn't have ended without them looking into anything he said?
It's certainly possible. We wouldn't know that. That would be a conversation that would go on deep underground. But it's conceivable that this investigation will spawn others. That happens all the time.
We have to go to a break, but my final question to you: when you were U.S. Attorney, I don't know how you quantify this, but if at all, how many public corruption cases are there that you're looking at, the FBI is looking at, that just never make it to charges, that just never made public and they fizzle out?
Hard to put a number on that, but there's always a strong undercurrent of things that are being looked at, and some things rise to the level where they're chargeable and some things don't, but it seems to go in waves.
And as part of the sentencing, Gordon Fox will likely lose his license to practice law.
Yes, once he's convicted of a felony, he will be stripped of his law license.
Robert Carendi, former Rhode Island U.S. Attorney, thank you very much for joining us.
Very welcome.
It's very fortunate to have you as a legal analyst here. When we come back, the ripple effects of this case, what changes might be happening up on Smith Hill. Ted Nesi and I continue our coverage of the Gordon Fox public corruption case. When we come back, stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. I am joined by WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi. This week we are discussing the public corruption case against former House Speaker Gordon Fox. At a news conference outlining the charges against Fox, U.S. Attorney Peter Nerona was asked what needs to change in order to end public corruption. This was his answer.
You know what? I think it's culture. I think we keep coming back to the same thing. I think there are instances where public officials, whether it be something in their public life or they're charged and convicted of something in their personal life, tax fraud, bank fraud. But there doesn't seem to be this notion that this is something which it should cause us to take notice. Should we be having sort of send-offs on the night before they go to prison? I mean, does that make sense? I think, I said about the political corruption amnesia. You can have someone who's violated the public trust and they're back running for office again 8 years later. The public, we have to recognize, as I said, I believe in second chances and rehabilitation. We do a lot of work with a lot of partners on that very issue. But when you violate the public trust, you shouldn't get a second chance. That's one place where you shouldn't get one. I mean, it's an incredible privilege to serve the people. I mean, I know that these guys, and when I was an assistant U.S. attorney, when I went into that courtroom and I said I represented the people of the United States, that's an incredible privilege, whether you're a prosecutor or you're a member of law enforcement. So our public officials should look at it the same way. It's a privilege, not a right. And you should serve the people and not yourselves. And the public should expect that from their public officials.
That was U.S. Attorney Peter Nerona announcing the charges against former House Speaker Gordon Fox in the public corruption case made public this week. Ted, you can't legislate your way out of public corruption, but what changes are on tap, do you think, in the wake of the Fox charges?
Well, you saw John Marion from Common Cause jump right onto this and asked for two things. He wants the Ethics Commission jurisdiction restored over state lawmakers and their official duties, and he wants regular audits of campaign finance reports. It was a lot of people didn't realize until Joe Almeida, another rep, was charged last month that there is no effort made, there's no provision to double check that the amount of money in a politician's campaign account matches their bank statement. statement. We saw with Gordon Fox, they said at one point he was reporting over $200,000 in his campaign account. The bank actually only had 50 grand in there, and no one could check. He was the treasurer. There was nothing.
And by the
there.
way, if you do the math on that, so you had 200,000 and then 50,000, the difference of that is not $108,000, which is what Gordon Fox is accused of moving. So there's some money that's still unaccounted for.
And they haven't answered the question.
They have not answered
that. Where's that other money? So we've already seen House Majority Leader John DeSimone put in a bill that would require those audits. The bank statements wouldn't be a public record, so it would still be a bit of a trust us situation, but at least the Board of Elections would have the right to look at that. Common Cause says it's not enough, but I think that will have some juice, at least on the House side. The Senate's been fairly quiet about all this. Maybe they say, well, the House has all these problems, but we're all right. I don't know if that will fly, but I think we're going to see some effort on that.
And of course, there's already been a significant change, right? I mean, just a year ago, a little less, we got a new House Speaker, and the policy impact of having a different House Speaker is enormous. So even before charges were levied, the ripple effects were felt.
Well, that was a funny thing about this week, right? You have this very dramatic case, Gordon Fox, charged bribery, corruption, etc. But there wasn't a lot of ripple effect. By the time Gordon Fox spoke on the courthouse steps, noontime, the story was basically over for that day, beyond Mattiello's comments about what might happen, because it all happened a year ago when he was kicked out of office. That was the drama. This was sort of the denouement of the whole thing. So I think, politically, they have all moved on from Gordon Fox. He's mostly old news. This was sort of the last time they had to deal with it. So it will be interesting. Maybe they won't even pass the campaign finance thing at all if it sort of fades out. It partly depends on if the public cares.
Well, John Marion of Common Cause wants to have the Ethics Commission strengthened again, as you point out, but it seems clear to me that is not likely to happen this session. House Speaker Nicholas Mattiello was asked if Fox's charges could spark another look at the Ethics Commission on Smith Hill, and this was his response.
No, absolutely not. The ethics rules don't even apply to what we're dealing with. So the premise of your question is absolutely false. It doesn't strengthen the system at all. So we'll look at that very independently. We'll take an independent look. But is it the year you have to do it? No, because the ethics rules don't apply to the situation we're talking about. And if a 3-year jail sentence doesn't deter someone, a $1,000 fine is meaningless.
Very ambiguous.
Yeah, which really just clear up the mystery for us there, Speaker. How do you really feel? But I mean, that is telling, isn't it? I mean, he is just not.
Absolutely.
It's not even on the table.
Mattiello, he's been pretty clear that people have brought this up to him multiple times since he took office, and he always says, no one I see out in public, the members of the public, my voters, they don't ask me about this. They don't care about this. This is an insider issue, this ethics commission.
But might they care more now? Even if he's right. I mean, he is right. If ethics commission, that might not have anything to do with moving campaign finance. And by the way, the bribery happened allegedly didn't happen as him as a lawmaker. Gordon Fox is a lawmaker. It happened under the Board of Licenses. So he has probably a correct argument that it wouldn't have an impact there. But public perception is different. So he might be hearing more about the Ethics Commission from his constituents, right?
But, I think Bob Correnti made a good point in the first half of the show. To some extent, for the members of the General Assembly, what do they care? Most of them, Nick Mattiello didn't have an opponent last year. He's the most powerful politician in the state, and no one even wanted to run against him for that slot. I mean, this is a legislature that the public largely, lets come back in each year, for the most part, at least half unchanged, other than retirements, so I just don't think there's a feeling of real pressure on the General Assembly as individual members. It's like Congress. Everyone may say they think we're all corrupt, but they like their local lawmaker. Most of us don't get booted out of office. I'm not saying that's good, but I do think that's part of the feeling up there is, the John Marions of the world will beat them over the head about Ethics Commission and stuff, but when it gets to election time, they're not in trouble, so what's the worry?
You and I have interviewed Gordon Fox countless times, and I know he has griped to me that his law practice suffered because of the time that he spent on Smith Hill. Motivation is not laid out in the court documents, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that money was tight for Gordon Fox. Are you hearing talk of, in the wake of all this, moving Rhode Island to be a full-time state legislature?
Yes, this surprised me a little, but there have been some folks who are saying quietly, well, this strengthens our case that you need to make sure your lawmakers, can make a decent living at their job. Right now they make about $15,000, unless they're Senate President or Speaker, then they get double that. I tend to think that's not going to happen. I don't think the public around has any interest in adding to the salaries or the time commitments of members of the General Assembly. But I do think there'll be some people say this is what you get when you have an avowedly part-time legislature, but a job like the speakership, which is close to full-time a lot of the year. It's all consuming.
Well, and there's no reason to think it would be a silver bullet fix. We checked it out. There are anywhere between 9 and 10 full-time legislatures in the country, depending on how you define it. And just looking at 2 of them, New York and Massachusetts, have had some very high-profile public corruption cases. All right, ask you something else here. Does this case cast a shadow, we have a minute left, or raise any questions about other policies or legislation that Fox has been involved in?
Well, I think that's in some ways the biggest impact of the actual case is the damage it does, the bribery charge especially. I mean, the idea that a man 2 years out of the most powerful position in Rhode Island politics was taking $52,000 from the owners of a bar to give them a liquor license. I mean, this was a man being empowered with basically final say over a $9 billion budget and a lot of other things. I think the public is naturally going to say, well, what else passed? I mean, people's minds will go to 38 studios. We know there's no federal investigation of that going on. Peter Nerone has said repeatedly, but I don't want to cast any aspersions without any evidence, but I can't blame members of the public who say, well, if he took $52,000 for a liquor license, what else happened during his public life?
WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi, thank you for joining us. If you want to catch any of our Gordon Fox coverage, it's online, WPRI.com. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.